You're listening to The Edge with Mark Thompson.
We've got a great conversation ahead with writer-director Billy Ray. I mean, he's a screenwriter who did The Hunger Games, he did Captain Phillips, he did Shattered Glass, he did the Richard Jewell film, which I just was late to the party on. It was really terrific. Clint Eastwood directed it. And his latest as a writer-director is The Comey Rule. It's a 2-episode event on Showtime, and I think it's on VOD now everywhere. And at this moment in time, before the last election, James Comey came forward with the announcement regarding the reopening of investigations into the Hillary Clinton emails. That definitely had an effect on the election. Billy Ray had very distinct views on just that and actually spoke to James Comey before doing this project. And he tells us about that conversation because, you know, Billy Ray then is talking to somebody who he kind of thinks is someone who was able to swing the election for Donald Trump, wittingly or unwittingly. So we'll talk about that, and we'll talk about the Comey Rule. But beyond that conversation, Billy Ray and I get into a lot of other stuff. He's a great guest. It's a great conversation. We'll start with Michael Shure on politics, and we'll get into Billy Ray. Thanks for being here. Let's get started.
This is The Edge.
The advantage it means.
Hey, look, I just spit on me for no reason.
That's horrible.
Is there some comfort in uncertainty, do you think?
You're a degenerate.
Because Australian Shepherds need action.
Wow. Yeah.
This is The Edge.
That's a self-loathing term that I use.
Oh, got it.
We love him when we can get him. He is Mr. Politics. He's Michael Shure. Hi, Michael.
Hey, guys.
Yeah, we're excited that you're here. I know you've been jetting all over the country. You're going from debate site to debate site. You've been going to various battleground states. You've also been going to some tight races for Congress. Where are you now?
I'm in neither a battleground state nor a very tight race for Congress. I'm in Montgomery, Alabama, and I'm doing really a story on the first Alabama election without John Lewis in a very long time. And not, you know, it's the first national election, but John Lewis's impact was felt most acutely in Selma, Alabama. And so we're going to be talking a little bit about what the struggle for the vote and where it is today and who carries the mantle forward from here on out now that Lewis is gone.
You know, as we talk, we're just coming off of the last debate. There are only 2 debates this go around because of the COVID-19 situation having, in essence, thrown one out of the mix. What should we be focusing on? I mean, obviously today a lot of people are focusing on debate and you're doing the, you know, the postmortem on the debate. But what are the things in this presidential race, in this political scene, what are the things that we should focus on?
Well, I mean, I think you have to focus. It's a hard question to answer, right? I mean, the time to focus is almost past us. The time to focus is when you're selecting a nominee and when you're deciding what matters to you with your vote. In terms of the predictive analysis here, I always focus on where the candidates are, especially where the incumbent is in any race, where they're going, where they're protecting their the lead that comes when you are the incumbent. But in this case, the challenger is the one who's had the lead consistently. So where does the incumbent go? He has to do something he didn't do in 2016, win a state he didn't, because he is certain to lose some that he did win. And at this point, even hold on to some other states. What the president seems to be doing now, Mark, is trying not to lose by a lot. And I say that because he's going to Georgia, he's going to Iowa, he's flirting with Texas. These are places where, and we've talked about it before, a Republican president, incumbent president seeking re-election should not have to worry about. But because the likelihood is that he is going to lose some of the states that I just mentioned that he wouldn't win, or that he won last time. Let's look at Michigan, Pennsylvania, Arizona. I think that he is trying to make sure that this is as close a race as possible so that he can contest it on other grounds.
Then the contesting of it would involve the courts.
Correct. Yeah. It would involve the courts. It would involve, state legislatures. It would involve, states, secretaries of state. It would involve governors in states that are favorable to him and sort of unmuddying the water. Or muddying the water.
Right, muddying it and then unmuddying it. I think that there is, you'd have to say, a path to victory, to use the phrase, but I don't think it's used in this context ever, in the manner in which you've described. He would do just that thing. But there is that path to victory. Muddy the water and then contest the results. You said something, though, to me along the way this week, which was interesting, which was, if there's a big enough drubbing, you didn't say it in these words, you're more eloquent than I, but you said, if he loses by enough, the challenging of the election results is going to be a lot harder.
For sure. And it's not just because legally it will be more difficult, but in terms of getting a team together to challenge it, getting colleagues in the Senate of like mind to come and say, the president's right, this is an outrage. If it's big enough drubbing, to use your infantile word, Mark, that you would not run into that problem. It'll be far more difficult for him to get other Republicans to be outraged at his loss if it was very, very, if there was a big enough margin there. So I think that's a big part of it, too. It's not just the legal standing you would have, but just the sort of the political zeitgeist of that kind of a moment.
It's funny, you give a lot of credit to political zeitgeist and sort of some sort of implied ethical overhang involved in this process that I don't give credit to, because I've seen the power grab.
I wouldn't say it's ethical, Mark. I think that these are people in Washington, and I do look at them through better eyes than most. That they're not all public servants in the most high-minded way. They all have egos, but I think you can have an ego and still be a public servant. I think anyone who's ever run for office it can be both. But I do think that there are people that like to keep the power. You just said the word power. And these are people that I wouldn't say they're doing it for the right or wrong reasons. I say they're doing it for the reasons of this is my best path to political survival. Now, there are a lot of people that are going to think that when Donald Trump, should he lose, is off the stage, that the Trump brand is going to be gone and they're going to return to a Bush-like brand in politics. There are only 44 people in the U.S. House, Republicans, who were there when George Bush was president. So that's a long time ago now. And the Bush brand is something that a lot of people don't know. But they do know when something isn't working. And if adhering to a way of politics that is only working with a certain segment that doesn't have a way of growing is apparent after this election, then people will run for that. And I don't think it's a question of ethics. I think it's a question of pure offense, playing offense and staying in power.
I thought it was interesting that among the many who have pledged support to Joe Biden, ex-administration officials, a lot of high-profile GOP, is the retired Admiral William McRaven. He's the guy who was behind taking down Osama bin Laden. He was behind taking down Saddam Hussein, and he was behind safely rescuing Captain Phillips. I mean, that's not a bad LinkedIn resume profile,
No,
So,
it isn't. You may also be interested in George Washington.
Right. So this guy, William McRaven, came out, and he also is notable not just for those achievements that I mentioned, but also for his politics. He's a big Second Amendment guy. He's a big, he's a right-to-lifer. He, in his politics, represents an extremely conservative bent. He throws his support squarely behind Joe Biden. He's been quite vocal about it. He was on CNN, and he wrote an op-ed for the Wall Street Journal. And it led me to this question for you, which is, as I mentioned, he may be the head of the parade this week, but this has been quite a substantial parade of GOP, ex-administration officials, all of whom are endorsing Joe Biden. You've talked about newspaper endorsement and media endorsement before, but I don't know if we've really touched on this in a big way. Does all of that matter? All of those endorsements from those people I've talked about, high profile and those from the administration, does it matter to the bottom line?
Yeah, I think it matters in a big way. And I think it's a way that people refuse to acknowledge because it makes, it makes it okay to invite Republicans under the tent. And I think a lot of people who are newer to this and who are far more ideological on the left side of the Democratic Party find it abhorrent that Joe Biden is okay with this and thinks that he doesn't need Republicans to win. He needs people on the left of the Democratic Party to come out in order to win. They're not wrong that he needs that, but he also does need Republicans. And when I say Republicans, what these endorsements do, newspaper endorsements are fine, right? You have an editorial board and they say you should unquestionably vote for Donald Trump or Joe Biden. Fine. They look at that. En masse, what does it mean? Well, there's skepticism of what the media's influence is anyway now, so it doesn't mean as much as it used to. And fewer people pick up the newspaper and read it and get to the editorial page and read that editorial in the first place. But what this does is it gives cover and comfort to people who are thinking in a like-minded way. So if you're a Second Amendment guy, if you are a conservative woman and you are not comfortable with the idea of voting for a Democrat, you've only voted for Republicans, you're scared of what will happen to the courts, and then you hear McRaven say it's okay, and then you hear Kasich say it's okay, and then you hear people from the Bush administration say it's okay, that they're all doing it, then it makes it easier for you to say, yes, I'm doing it. And what that does is that speaks to me to there's a lot of talk about the shy Trump voter, right? This media concoction, and I don't say that, in a pejorative way because I think it's true. People who will not say that they're voting for Donald Trump, but they'll get into the ballot box and they'll vote for Donald Trump. Well, I also think that there are shy Biden voters. There are voters in communities that are more conservative who work in offices or, Zoom from home to Zoom calls, who socialize on Facebook with people who are more conservative, who won't admit that they're Biden supporters. And this gives those people cover as well. So I think it is important in a far more subtle way, but a very important and very sort of cumulative way when you have all these people doing it.
Michael, you're generous with your time, especially as you're covering these last-minute stories that are associated with major political races. I will ask you about the Niners because you're a huge Niners fan.
It's tough. Raheem Mostert getting hurt, our best running back, that was too bad. We have a young kid who may do okay, but we need a running game. It's not a great football year so far. But let's see. We won the last game against the Rams, and nobody thought we could, and now we play the Patriots, and, man, I love the Niners. So let's hope they do well.
You do. Well, good luck.
Mark, I'm in Central Time now. Of the American time zones, can we rank them?
Oh, Pacific really is the best, I think.
You do?
And I would say Pacific, and then I'm going Pacific, and I'm going Eastern. Now, I might be biased because that's where I grew up, in those two places. But I'm going Pacific, Eastern, Central. Yeah, I'm sorry. That's the way I see it.
And then Mountain is always in fourth place. And we're keeping the sort of Hawaiian Aleutian time out of this. But, why do you see – if you think Pacific is the best, you should then think that Eastern's the worst.
No. And I'll tell you why. Because – unfortunately, we've organized media events and major sporting events and other events around those two time zones, really around the Eastern time zone. Like prime time is at 8 o'clock in the East. So it is, from a lifestyle standpoint, many of the things that you want to watch on television or participate in, they're timed for, I'm talking about if they extend, I understand if you want to participate in some church service or whatever, it's in your backyard, they're going to, whatever time, it's local. But what I'm saying is the Eastern time zone is where a lot of different media events and different huge things go down. Now, the benefit of being in the Pacific time zone is once you've time shifted, you can enjoy all of that stuff without it torching the rest of your night. It's not just sporting events. It's a lot of primetime stuff and,
Well, that's true, yeah.
Yeah, but this is important. So to whatever extent you're participating in various media, you benefit from that time shift on the Pacific time zone, which is why I put them number one. But from a lifestyle standpoint, it is true. Things are organized for the East Coast. That's why I put them number two.
Okay.
Do you agree? What do you do? How do you do it?
I agree-ish. I think that the answer, the only reason to say Pacific is because football is over essentially at 4 p.m. and you still have time to do other things. And the I don't know if you didn't grow up on the East Coast, the end of the 4 o'clock games on the East Coast, that 7 o'clock, 7:15 time was always kind of depressing.
And the other thing, Michael, not to interrupt you, but just to interrupt you, I would say that the evening game now on Sunday night, if you're on the East Coast, that doesn't end until very late. And that's the problem. Now, the upside is if you want to go to breakfast or something on the East Coast, you can do that, and it's not during the games. They don't start till 1.
That is an upside. That is an upside. And, there's no question. So I'm going to say Eastern time.
No.
And then I'm going to say.
Well, like me. Okay.
I'm going to say Eastern, Central, Pacific Mountain.
Wow.
Yeah.
I knew, by the way, when I went Pacific is the best, then Eastern, I knew that Michael was not going to have the same order. If for no other reason, I'm not saying that these aren't your sincere choices, but I knew that once I had chosen them, I felt that you were going to carve out your own territory. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, there you go. This is why we're friends, because you couldn't be more right.
He is our political guy. Reach him on Twitter at Michael Shure, Shure. Love you, Michael. Thank you.
Love you guys. Thanks so much. Thanks.
And now, award-winning director and writer, Billy Ray.
This is The Edge.
One of the great podcast guests, or guests of any kind for any radio show. I've tried to road test him through every medium on every platform, and he's great, for real. I encourage all producers to book him. He's director, writer, Billy Ray.
Thank you for having me, Mark.
Not that you need it. You got super high profile with the Comey Rule. It got a lot of good viewership, and it's a story that's based on that Comey book. Now, you had read the book, Billy Ray? Is that how did this thing happen?
Well, I had a lot to say about the Trump administration and was looking for a way to say it. And then just out of nowhere, I get a call from this producer named Shane Salerno saying, do you want to adapt Comey's book? And this was the night before it was published. And I said, get me a copy right now. And they got me a copy that day, and I read it overnight and called them the next morning. I said, I'm in. That was April of 2018.
As I recall, and frankly, one of the refreshing things about your origin story on the Comey Rule is that you, like myself, and I think like a lot of Americans, felt, hey, this guy, James Comey, he might be a great guy, and he might be a great FBI guy, and he might be a great administrator, and he might be a great American. But he may have made the move that threw the election to Donald Trump. You shared that view, and yet your view changed.
Oh, yeah. I mean, my first contact with him was a phone call in which I was sort of auditioning for the job, because if he didn't want me to adapt his book, Shane would have picked somebody else. And for about 10 minutes, this phone call with, Comey in Virginia and me in Los Angeles and Shane also in Los Angeles, and then 2 of Comey's book agents in DC and another 2 in New York. For about 10 minutes, the call was going great. I was pitching my tail off and he was loving everything I was saying. And then one of the agents said to me, how are you going to handle the Hillary thing? And I said, well, we got to take it head on. I mean, I don't want to write an unflawed character. And, dramatically, it's Frankenstein. I mean, you created the monster and the monster destroyed you. And Comey said, how did I create the monster? I said, well, sir, you got him elected. And there was this pause. And he said, there were other factors. I said, that may be, but you created a 6-point swing and that was enough. And he hired me anyway. To me, that's very much a story about him, not about me. I wouldn't have hired me given those circumstances. He knew how I felt about some of the decisions he had made. He still knows how I feel about some of the decisions he had made. But he picked me because he thought I was going to be fair. And, in the year and a half that I was working with him, I guess it's more than that now, he's never tried to manipulate me. He's never tried to spin me. He's never tried to steer me into creating a more flattering portrait of him than I wanted to. That says a lot about him. The other thing to factor in here is that once I started to do the research, I heard from no less than James Clapper himself, the Director of National Intelligence, that it wasn't Comey that was the deciding factor in that election. It was the infiltration of the Russians. That was the deciding factor in the election, which only made me more convinced that I had to tell this story.
Yeah, that's the interesting thing, I think, first of all, that's a great story. I mean, you with Comey, and I think the impression one gets watching the Comey Rule, your depiction of events and your profile of this character as we see played out in the Comey Rule, you get a positive impression of him, but you also see the immense challenge that the agency, the FBI, was up against because they have this information and how to handle it. And won't it influence things? And might a failure to announce it also be perceived as influencing things. I mean, it didn't appear that there was a good road to take. I thought that was, clearly drawn out. People might have been aware of it before. I mean, I was aware of it, obviously, as it was going on and as it was discussed after the fact. But, wow, when you see all the events played out like that, it reminds you of a lot of little specific things and even the timeline, and it's brought to life again. But the Clapper thing, to me, when you tell your origin story, again, to use that phrase, to tell, how you came to the project, the Clapper thing really speaks to something that, the rest of us don't really have a real perspective on. He feels that the disinformation that the Russians pounded the American public with through social media, that was the thing that was far more damning for the Democrats and Hillary than anything that Comey did?
Yes. Look, in an election in which 137 million Americans voted, 126 million Americans were exposed to disinformation from Russia on Facebook alone. 126 million people. And we're now seeing it happening again. That's not a matter of conjecture, it's a matter of fact. There are supposedly right-wing conservative news sites that are actually just Russian news sites, posing as American conservative news sites. This is happening right now. It's happening on Facebook rampantly. The intelligence community knows what to look for now, so they're quicker to spot it now. And that's encouraging. However, this time in 2020, the Russians have the full knowledge and perhaps willing participation of the commander-in-chief. That's new and pretty daunting. Part of what I wanted to do with this miniseries, 2 parts, 3.5 hours, what I wanted to do with this miniseries was everybody who experienced the election of 2016 believes that they know what happened. But what they believe is completely influenced by the lens through which they saw that election. In other words, if you were watching Fox News, you had a very different experience of that election than if you were watching MSNBC. And my belief was, let's take people inside the rooms where they couldn't gain access before. CNN wasn't inside those rooms, but our movie can be. And let's show people what actually went into the decision-making process at the FBI and at the DOJ and at the White House. And then let people make up their own minds. In other words, the point of the story is to say, okay, be Jim Comey for 5 minutes. Here are the facts on the ground. Here are the pressures. Here are the constraints. Here are the political realities. What would you do? And that's not an apology for Jim Comey. That is an exploration of the process by which Jim Comey and his team arrived at their decisions. And whether you like those decisions or not, and I have qualms with them too, you cannot question that process. That process was absolutely pure, and its intentions were absolutely pure.
Seeing the process, seeing what was going on inside is fascinating. And it so makes you appreciate the public servants who work in that environment, particularly now as your every utterance, your every move, your every text is filleted and used in some political ad.
Yeah, I mean, these are the people that Donald Trump mischaracterizes as the deep state, which I find infuriating and offensive, and I think every American should too. What he calls the deep state is a group of public servants who love their country, believe fiercely in democracy, and believe totally in the apolitical intentions of the institutions that make that democracy possible. But part of what I wanted to comment on in the story is, one thing that Americans get wrong is the way we think about our institutions. In other words, you have to stop thinking of the FBI as an institution. The FBI is a group of people who are stewards of an institution. And the FBI, it's not the building that makes decisions. It's the people inside the building. And if you need an example of that, go look at our post office. It's a very different animal when run by Louis DeJoy than if it were run by an actual human being who cared about getting people's mail delivered on time. And the Department of Justice is a very different animal if it's run by an attorney general who cares about the rule of law than if it is run by Bill Barr, who is the current attorney general, who is an absolute political hack, who is just using the Department of Justice as sort of an enforcement arm of the White House's political machine. Again, institutions are composed of people, and those people can have good judgment or bad judgment, or good intentions or bad intentions, but they take America with them where they go. And I thought it was really important that we look at that.
I love what you just said because it extends to the other institutions as well. I mean, I know that you know this. I mean, you could have gone, a half block down Pennsylvania Avenue or to whatever, to the EPA, where Andrew Wheeler denies and actively and aggressively testifies against the linkage of a climate crisis and many of the crises we're deling with now. Talking about natural disasters, fires, and yeah.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but specifically about the EPA. Before we started shooting, when I was in DC scouting locations, someone told me that the lobby of the EPA was appropriate for a particular scene. So I and my production team went to go scout the lobby. And we walked in there on a Tuesday at 2:30. And I want to tell you something. There was nobody there. I mean, nobody there. There were 6 security guards and, a scanner that you had to walk through. But other than the 6 security guards, nobody walked through that lobby. And I stood there for a half hour. And it's not like the elevators were moving. The only thing moving in there was a tumbleweed, which blew past me. But I'm telling you, the EPA, as we know it, doesn't exist anymore.
That was the idea, to completely dismantle it. And they've done it. And the same is going on at Interior. That guy Bernhard.
Interior, State Department is now operating at 1/3 of its capacity in terms of personnel. And those might not be things that Americans can feel on a day-to-day basis. In other words, you wake up in the morning and you can't really tell that 2/3 of the State Department isn't there anymore. That doesn't mean that you are not less safe, because you are less safe because there aren't people there doing those jobs. And, I just want to say that for anyone who's listening out there who may have voted for Trump, I get it. I really do. I understand what was fun and what was funny about Donald Trump in 2016. And I understand why it was, probably really heartening to watch him own the libs. And the truth is, my party, the Democratic Party, had lost touch in 2016. And we have to embrace that. We have to learn from that. And I can understand why it was appealing to have a presidential candidate say, I'm going to go blow up the federal government. I understand why that would have had enormous appeal among a certain group of the voting population. The problem is that he did it. He did blow up the federal government, and there isn't one anymore. And that's why there are 208,000 Americans who are dead because of COVID, because the federal government is supposed to be the thing that stands between us and chaos. And we don't have one now. That's why your kid just did, is about to do fall quarter on your couch. And that's why you're scared to death about your mom in the nursing home. And that's why there are, patients lined up in hospital parking lots because there aren't any ICU beds available anymore, and there aren't enough ventilators, and there isn't enough PPE. The federal government is the only thing that can stand between us and something the size of COVID. Private industry will not, and no individual can. But if you make the decision not to have a federal government, you're taking your chances. And this is not an argument about big government versus small government. I'm talking about just functional, competent, muscular government. We don't have it. We dismantled it.
And the specifics as they relate to COVID is when you have a situation and problem as immense as the COVID-19 pandemic, you need institutions. I mean, in this case, you need systems, might be the better word, that can only exist on the federal level at the level that you need them to exist to really address the problem.
And I'll tell you something else. This has nothing to do with the Comey rule, except in the most tangential way. But I spend a lot of time in the political space. Right now, it's about 90% of my day, helping candidates in any way that I can. And one of the things that's become really clear to me is that Donald Trump had this election in his hand. If last December he would have stood before the American people and said, here's what's coming, here's the danger, I'm now ordering more ventilators, I'm ordering more tests, I'm ordering more PPE, we're all going to start wearing masks, he wins this election in a walk. There's no doubt in my mind. And he had that in his grasp. The Republican Party had it in their grasp. He chose instead to pretend it wasn't coming, to deny it when it got here, to tell people not to wear masks. And this economy is now going to be around his neck for the rest of his life, aside from the appalling numbers of dead Americans.
Right, the necks of the rest of us that have to deal with it as well.
Correct.
You as a writer, I was struck, I'm not a writer, but I went to all the classes about writing Greek tragedies, and then all the different, Arthur Miller, In other words, I've seen great theater, great writing. You yourself, I think, have done some incredible work. But my point in mentioning it in this context is it's almost literary this fall. Someone who, as you suggest, had captured with charisma or circus performer or whatever Trump is, some significant enough number of the American public that was disaffected and angry and had been let down by the other party or who had just felt that that were tired of being politically correct, all that stuff. That guy rose to the highest position in the land, and this is the literary part, that, as you suggest, he had this fatal flaw, which was that he really didn't have any interest in the job, didn't really know anything, didn't want to read anything about it or be told anything about it, that he really just wants to have people say, Mr. President, salute him, go play golf, and not deal with the business of managing. And that, in a literary sense, leads to this fall of this great nation. To me, it really almost is like some kind of tragedy from literature.
Well, first, I don't accept the premise that you're not a writer, because I think you write every day. And what you do on your show, that's writing. It may not be 3-act movie structure, but it's writing. I mean, you are certainly creating a character and other characters around him, and you're writing dialogue. So I would pat myself on the back if I were you. But in terms of Comey and Trump, yeah, I thought they were Shakespearean characters and much more interesting than anything that I could have created. What I thought about a lot as I was writing the script and as I was communicating to my brilliant actors, Jeff Daniels and Brendan Gleeson, I talked to them a lot about the movie Rain Man, believe it or not. The basic tension of Rain Man is that you've got a Tom Cruise character who can charm anybody and talk anybody into anything. And he is faced with Dustin Hoffman, who, because he's autistic, can't be charmed and can't be convinced of anything. And the entire movie is the friction between those two ideas. It's Tom Cruise wondering, like, what club do I have to take out of my bag that will work on this guy? And that's the entire movie, until he becomes a human being and finds out he can communicate with him through emotional means. That's Rain Man. And so what I was talking about with Brendan and with Jeff was, here's Comey, who believes that he can ennoble anyone he's talking to, that he can turn anyone he's talking to into a decent person. And here's Trump, who believes that he can corrupt and bully anybody he's talking to. And our movie is about the conflict between those two ideas, because neither one of them is going to win. If you think about the 10 scenes between these two men as 10 rounds in a boxing match, Comey wins a few, Trump wins a few, but they don't change each other because neither is capable of change. And so you have these two tectonic plates rubbing up against each other, and an earthquake's coming, but it's not like either tectonic plate is going to win. That seemed like the stuff of really, really good drama to me. But if you don't mind, if I go on for just a second about sort of the dynamic of Trump as a person himself, do you mind if I do a little?
No,
riff
please
on
do.
that?
And then I'm going to double back and ask you about what I felt. It's a scene I could watch over and over and over again, the dinner scene. But we'll ask you about it. Please continue, and we'll double back for it.
I talk about the dinner scene. I love talking about the dinner scene. I have access to all kinds of polling because of the work that I do with candidates. And one of the most interesting things that we see in the polling, people ask me all the time, why does that 40% of America stick with Trump, no matter what he says, no matter what he does? And by the way, it's worth telling that the day Richard Nixon left office, his approval rating was still at 29%. That's a lot of Americans who were still ready to go down with the ship. Anyway, what we find is that 40%, those Trump supporters, they don't actually like him. They find him vile. They find him childish. Even the most ardent Trump supporters want him to stop tweeting. So why do they stay with him? The reason they stay with him is because he validates their hatred of liberals and the media and elites and the coasts And I hate to say it, but in some cases, Black people. And so they don't mind that Trump is vile and childish because Trump is standing up to something that they absolutely loathe. As long as Trump is taking shots at, Nancy Pelosi or Rachel Maddow or, someone like me, they don't care what he does or what he says. Their rage at the left is so extreme, so all-consuming, that they will put up with COVID deaths, a crappy economy, higher prescription drug prices, the absence of health care, the despoiling of our environment, or the refusal to disavow white supremacists. They'll put up with all of it, just as long as he is still throwing hooks and haymakers at the left. And it's important when you think of them in those terms to know that in that context, Trump is not the problem. Trump is the symptom. The problem is those deep resentments and hatreds. And as a country, we're going to have to deal with them in a serious way, or we're not going to move forward no matter who's president.
I always said, and I've said it repeatedly on the air in different, here and elsewhere, he hates the same stuff that you others hate who support him. I mean,
that's right.
It's that simple. I mean, no one can, celebrate him as an orator or as a thinker. I will say this, and then I will double back to Comey Rule because I've got a bunch of questions about it. It's really I really encourage people to check it out. But anyway, I was so disappointed and yet at the same time, in a way, not surprised at the way all of America bought the BS about what a great businessman he is. I mean, I read all these pieces in the New Yorker and all these longer pieces in even the New York Times that detailed, his bankruptcies, his failures. The great New York Times piece I read was about how they took this guy who was, this office was sort of dingy. I mean, we see this sort of gold cast apartment and he's got the supermodel wife, his third wife or whatever, and it all looks so, he comes out in a bathrobe, not literally, but figuratively. And, it all just looks like this gilded life. The reality is, he had sold a bunch of these businesses and hotels, and he had this, these dinged up desks that sat there at Trump Tower. Anyway, point is, in this piece, they detailed all of that, some of the same things that I just referenced, and yet they were so effective at varnishing over all the bad stuff and letting the Apprentice image of him like, slow motion walking into every shot and choppering into every episode, they let that sing, and America never saw through it.
Well, some of America did, but I think most of America, like me, believed that if an article was in the New Yorker, that for some reason, someone in rural Oklahoma was reading it, and that turned out not to be true.
That's just not it. Yeah, you're right.
The vast majority of Americans get their news from Fox News or Sinclair Radio, and that story was not being told on Fox News and Sinclair Radio in the same way that the COVID story is not being told on Fox News or Sinclair Radio. There's so many things that Trump has exposed about the American character. One of them is that in America, we mistakenly believe that if you have money, you must be smart. In Europe, they don't do that. In Europe, they're totally used to having bozos in a royal family, so they know you can have money and be a complete idiot. But in America, we don't believe that. In America, we believe in the American dream that you get somewhere by hard work and talent and gumption. Trump has none of those things. What Trump is, it became really clear, is Trump is a hobo's fantasy of what it would like to be rich. You can imagine a person living on the street saying, boy, if I had $1 jillion, I'd have a building and my name would be on it in big gold letters. And I'd have a super hot, wife. And if I wanted to, I would cheat on her, and I'd go on TV shows and I'd say whatever I wanted, and I'd have a limo. Like that's a fantasy of who Trump is and what wealth actually represents. But enough of America bought into it. He also had the great good fortune of running against Hillary, who was just not a good candidate. I mean, I'm sure she would have been a great president, but not a terribly effective candidate. And he also had the incredible good fortune of following up the first African-American president of all time in a decidedly racist country. That certainly helped. And of course, he had the most important help, which was he had an entire country in Russia that was going to make sure he got elected.
Yes, and I would say, and you sort of alluded to it in a different context, but I would put it again in this context. He had a tremendous mouthpiece through Fox News Channel and, the Associated Conservative broadcast, but Fox News Channel is the most watched cable network. And to have them squarely in your corner and essentially operating as propagandists for you, that's a huge advantage.
It is an unheard of advantage. And I think one could make the argument that if Fox News, Sinclair Radio, and Breitbart had existed in 1974, Richard Nixon would have finished his second term.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, great point. And the last thing, and then I am going to get back to the Comey rule, but the last thing I would say on this, just because we're sort of now doing the ashes of the last election, I would put in those ashes, I would put the mainstream media. I mean MSNBC and CNN, because people forget they weren't covering Bernie Sanders with 20,000 people in an arena in Vermont or in other New England cities where he also was. And by the way, not just New England. I mean, Bernie Sanders was drawing big crowds. I'm talking about Trump-esque sized crowds. This is in the primaries. They weren't covering that the way they were Trump. Trump was being covered. By now it's almost one of those things that's said all the time, an empty podium. They're covering that more than they're covering Bernie Sanders at a rally of 20,000. And the reason for that, I totally get. He's a circus performer. He's like, who doesn't want to watch him? He's a crazy, charismatic, bizarro, rich guy. I don't want him to be president, but, for just television viewing, he's better for CNN and MS. And those guys, I feel like they were co-conspirators, willing or unwilling.
100%. What troubles me about that, look, they have every right to cover a Trump rally because that is news. That's fine. What disturbed me about it was the way CNN would then discuss the Trump rally and have Kayleigh McEnany on the panel or Jeffrey Lord on the panel or Rick Santorum on the panel. As if
they had Corey Lewandowski was a regular paid panel. He was a full-time employee.
Lewandowski, and it made it sound like, well, you've got a point and I've got a point, and we just sort of disagree. When in fact, that was not what was happening at all. One side was talking about democracy and the other side was talking about authoritarianism, and CNN was treating it like they were both valid points of view. And that was the false equivalency that Bill Maher kept talking about over and over and over again at the top of his lungs. And he was absolutely right. They created a false choice for America. And there were a lot of people, they're called hold your nose voters, people who hated Hillary and hated Trump and thought they were both the same thing. And those hold your nose voters all broke for Trump in the last 10, 11 days of that election. And that was dispositive. That was the end. And what you're seeing now is hold your nose voters are all breaking Biden. And that's going to be a big difference.
Look, you're not a clairvoyant. I mean, no one can say what's going to happen. But even as you talk about the hold your nose voters this time seeming to break for Biden, it would appear in sufficient enough numbers for him to win this election, at least as far as popular vote goes. And even in swing states, it would appear, I mean, if the election is pure, that he should be able to win even the Electoral College. What's happened is there is an active subversion of the process by the president. Now he's come out of the shadows, I think, on it, right? What's going to happen with this election, in your judgment?
Oh, boy, no idea. I'm lucky my job is writing and directing. I feel like I have a much better handle on how to do that than how to prognosticate an election. I was absolutely sure that Trump would lose in 2016 and promised my kids for 18 months that there was zero chance he was going to win. So I've given up predicting that. What I can tell you is if you just look at the raw data, in a clean election, he loses huge based on current trends. I just don't know if it'll be a clean election. I don't know. I know there are a lot of smart people who are going to great lengths to make sure that the election is clean. And I'm very heartened by that. And by the way, even Trump voters should be heartened by that, because everybody should want the election to be an actual reflection of the will of the people. But I just don't know what the results will be. I imagine there will be, I imagine in some places there will be some armed conflict. That doesn't sound out of the realm of possibility to me at all.
Well, it's being encouraged, so from the top. Last thing on what you just said, in a way I've never seen before, have seen hints of it, but the will of the people means much less than the will of some people to maintain power. And you've got a minority in power, and they want more power. They want every branch of government because they have an agenda. It's I would suggest, a religious agenda in large measure in many cases, but it's also a legislative agenda. It's whatever you're smoking, you have your own agenda. And what I see in a naked power grab way is that agenda really leading the way and the ends justifying the means.
Yeah, of course. Look, I understand why Trump is doing that. When I was doing my research for Comey, there was an intelligence community member who said to me in a very, very flat way of Trump, that motherfucker is going to die in prison. And I think that's what's coming. I think that when Trump, the second Trump is no longer president, he is going to be indicted. And I think it's going to come from the state of New York, where a presidential pardon won't be able to help him. So if I were Trump, yeah, I'd be scrambling too to try to make sure that I won that election and staved all of this off. Exactly. And it explains a lot of what's going on with Bill Barr and Ivanka and Jared and the rest of the clown car. Of course, I understand why they're trying to scramble to hold on to power. What I don't understand and will never understand is why Nikki Haley feels the need to support this, or why Joni Ernst in Iowa, or Susan Collins in Maine, or Cory Gardner in Colorado, or Martha McSally in Arizona, why they feel that this sinking ship is the right thing to tie their political fortunes to. That's a little harder to understand. They're all trailing. So is Tom Tillis in North Carolina. I really feel there's a very good shot that they're all going to lose. And it's because he's an anvil. And it's not, by the way, like they're rooting for, Rudy, or when I say Rudy, I mean the football player.
Right, I got it.
It's not like they're rooting for the underdog who's got, justice on his side, but, is just scrappy. They're rooting for someone who is trying to subvert democracy. That's going to be their legacy. That's going to be the asterisk by their name. It's about history. Why they're doing this is much harder for me to understand.
I want to now go back to the Comey rule because there's some riveting sequences in this two-parter. It's it's over 2 nights, and I don't know. Now it continues to run on Showtime, so you still watch it over 2 nights. You can, I guess, people record it too or whatever.
Yes,
all the different
and now you can get it on Hulu. You can get it on Amazon.
So I thought it was riveting, and one of the riveting sequences, one of the real standout riveting sequences is the dinner. And this, again, you think you remember all this stuff, but, because Comey took all these contemporaneous notes after dinner and, he was really trying to memorialize as much of the interaction with Trump as he could. I remembered that actually as I watched the Comey rule, as I watched this depiction that we're talking about. And this dinner was absolutely riveting to watch come to life on screen. Tell me about shooting it. I want to know everything about it. I want to know about writing it. I want to know about shooting it. I want to know how long it took. Did you shoot? There were 2 dinners, I think. Did they both happen, at the same time? Tell me everything. I love that sequence.
Thank you. In a movie like this, that's as close to an action sequence as we get. That's our Born Identity car chase is the loyalty dinner. It was always the centerpiece of the script. It was the most important scene in the script. Everything leads up to it and everything extends from it. It was the moment as a character in which Comey really realized what he was dealing with. My feeling as I was writing it was, I knew I was writing a long scene. Typically you try to keep scenes as brief as possible. But I felt like this was going to be an operatic moment. This was going to be what you'd call a set piece. And so I wrote what I figured would be an 8.5-minute scene. But I felt that Trump was going to be so compelling and that Comey's reactions were going to be so emotionally connective for the audience that they would be able to withstand a scene of that length. The day that we shot it was really, really significant because we were moving so fast on that shoot. It was a 51-day schedule, and we were shooting essentially 2 movies, which means we were moving faster than I moved when I made the first indie I ever directed, which was a little movie called Shattered Glass. You know, I had 28 days to shoot that movie. So we were moving faster than that. What that meant was that every day we were shooting 4 scenes, sometimes 5, sometimes 6, but we were never shooting just one. The only scene that got its own shooting day in the entire schedule was the loyalty dinner, where we just went to one location and shot one scene, albeit an 8.5 pager. It was the first day that Jeff Daniels and Brendan Gleeson worked together. So there was a dynamic that we were just going to be capturing for the first time, and that was unbelievably exciting. It was the only day James Comey was on set. I had made sure that if he was going to come for one day, it was going to be the loyalty dinner. He brought one of his daughters, who I think was 18 or 19. So imagine being Jeff Daniels, right? You've got 8.5 pages of dialogue. You're squaring off with Brendan Gleeson, who is definitely the bells and whistles part of the movie. Like, he gets all the fireworks. And really all you do in that scene is react. And you have to have enough confidence in the power of your stillness, the power of your silence, to know that you're going to be as compelling as the guy who has all the fireworks. Jeff has that, thank God. But then the guy you're playing is standing over your shoulder watching a monitor while you do it. So that's what Jeff was dealing with. On top of that, as usual, I had no rehearsal. I literally just said, I blocked the scene for them. I said, here's where you're going to stand, here's where you're going to stand, here's where you sit, here's where you sit. And the first time they ran those lines opposite one another, we were shooting.
Wow.
And then the last part of it, which is a part that you wouldn't notice, but I hope you'll go back and relook at the scene, because it was something that was really important to me. As they enter the room, you can see that there's a light over the table in the center of the room. And then there are lots of lights on the walls and lamps that are on behind them over their shoulders. And what we did was, once Trump says, I need loyalty, I expect loyalty. Once he said that, we started very slowly to dim all the lights on the stage except the one that was right over their head. And you'd never notice it because it's a 5.5-minute dim. You can do that when the scene is as long as this is. But by the end of the scene, there are no lights behind them. The lamps are off behind them. The only light in the scene is the light right above them, because I wanted it to feel like these 2 guys were on an island and that there was just nothing around them but just sort of the sea at night. And I'm thrilled that no one's ever asked me about it, because it means that it worked. No one noticed it. But it, to me, is part of the reason that the scene feels the way that it does, because there's this creeping darkness around them that you can't feel in a conscious way, but it's working on you.
That's absolutely right. And I didn't notice it, but you describe it perfectly. The scene has an intensity, but I love that you said darkness, because it does. It feels dark and intense. And then, as all the things that Trump has talked about as a mobster and talked about, you get that feeling. Like, that must be what it's like to talk to a super powerful guy who can F up your life, I could watch that scene over and over and over again, so I can't wait to go back and see it and notice that you've just described. It's
and
interesting.
I'll say something else about that scene. Sorry to interrupt.
Yeah.
One of the things about that scene, once we shot it and I saw a first assembly of it put together by my editor, Jeff Ford, who I think is the best editor in the business, instantly I felt like, okay, this is really powerful. This really works. And so what I started to do was I would bring in members of the cast and members of the crew while we were still shooting. We had over a month to go, but I would show them just that scene. And people were so fired up. Like, they sat there and watched an 8.5-minute scene, and they came out breathing fire thinking, okay, I'm a part of something that's going to be really special. And
Yeah,
it got us
I get
home
that.
the rest of the
Yeah.
way. It was absolute ammunition for me, because you could just see as you watch the scene, oh, that's the level of performances were great. And people reacted that way.
You shot it in Washington, or where it seemed as though there were a lot of federal buildings. I mean, if they weren't federal buildings, they doubled for federal buildings perfectly.
We shot 4 days in DC and 47 days in Mississauga, Ontario, which is right outside Toronto. Those 4 days in DC, we shot every exterior we could, and some important interiors that you just couldn't find anywhere else. But the vast majority of the shoot was in Toronto.
And lastly, the thing that I say lastly, maybe it won't be technically last, but close. We're wrapping up with you. You've been so lovely. But I do think that there's a lot here in the Comey rule that, again, I thought I knew, and I did know, okay? But so much crap has happened since then that I'd forgotten it. Like, one of the things I remembered, again, in the moment was he was going after all these people who, from a political standpoint, were partisans on his side. That is to say, Republicans.
Yes.
I'm talking about Trump now going after them.
Yes. Look, that's how my boss operates. You remain in the family as long as you are useful to me. And the second you are no longer useful to me, I'm going to get rid of you. I'm going to make your life hell, if not end it. That is the mob. I don't know why anyone continues to be surprised about it. How many times do you have to see people leave his administration having been absolutely loyal to him? And the second they're out, if they voice an opinion at all, he just buries them. How many Anthony Scaramucci's are there going to be before people start to notice the pattern?
Right. This really will be the last question for Billy Ray, but you made a decision, and it's a decision, I'm not spoiling anything. This happens right away at the beginning. And it reminded me, you tell the story through one of the characters in Trump's world, or you tell it, at least it's the launching pad for the story. And it reminded me of Salieri and Mozart. I saw the stage show of Amadeus on Broadway, and it was brilliantly done there, and it was brilliantly, I thought, done by Milos Forman, in the cinema. And you do something, a version of that. We get into the story. You have to get into it somehow, and you do it in this way. So please tell, because it felt Salieri-ish to me.
Well, I couldn't be more flattered or more thrilled, because that was the goal. At script level, I knew I needed a narrator because there was just so much information that had to get unloaded in this movie, and some of it you just can't do through dialogue without it being clunky and horrible. So I knew I needed a narrator. So I thought, okay, who would be the most interesting person to narrate this? Well, someone who doesn't like Comey, that would be good, because then you could immediately say to the audience, I know you're conflicted about James Comey. Now I'm going to give someone a voice to articulate what it is you don't like about Comey. That seemed like a really good idea. And then I had two choices. I could either have Trump narrate it, or I could have Rod Rosenstein narrate it. And the temptation was high to do Trump, but I thought Rosenstein was the better idea, specifically because I wanted to do a tribute to Amadeus. And I wanted Rosenstein to be the Salieri to Comey's Mozart. Someone once told me, who had been in the U.S. Attorney's Office when Rosenstein and Comey both were, that Rosenstein knew he was never going to be the guy that people wanted to have a beer with. That was Chris Christie, and that was Comey. They were the dynamic leaders of that group of prosecutors that were all sort of coming of age at the same time. And I thought, well, that's really great. I can tell the story of Comey through someone who's always been envious of him. And I could do this tribute to for me, the 8th greatest movie of all time, Amadeus. And it seemed like a really good fit. And I'm thrilled you responded that way. That really, really gratifies me.
Oh, yeah. That's so cool to hear you talk about it that way. First of all, I love that Billy Ray ranks. He really does. He ranks the movies. Number 5 is this, number 6 is that. Because I know you've lectured a lot of screenwriters all along the way. And so I guess as academics, you kind of rate everything that way. I always feel like you can't compare movies. I mean, so you couldn't build a list. That's why I think the Academy Awards are so ridiculous. I'm supposed to compare Amadeus and Gandhi, or whatever. Come on, are you kidding? But anyway, you think you can? Okay, all right.
I have, and what I'd like to do is, if you wouldn't mind, I'll come back for another podcast, and we'll go over my top 100 English-speaking movies of all time.
I'd love that.
And
I'd love that.
you tell me which ones you want to ding. You want to argue? We can argue all night.
You come with your list, and I'll come with my list, mother. Okay.
Fine.
So it worked. It really did work. And I'm so glad, and I was so grateful that you didn't tell the story. It is called The Comey Rule, and it's based on this book that James Comey wrote. I was so grateful that you didn't tell the story with James Comey being the narrator. I felt that would have just been desperately awful. You know what I mean?
No, it's funny. I try not to read too many reviews because I think that's really unhealthy, whether they're good or bad. But I did have a publicist who sent me a few, and some of the ones that ripped us, and there were a few, but they didn't actually rip the movie. What they were ripping was that we had made a movie about Jim Comey. There are people that are so angry at him that they just feel we didn't have the right to tell his story. They didn't come after the filmmaking in any way. They just came after our existence. And what that taught me was that even in a country as polarized as ours, there is one thing that everybody agrees on, which is that they're mad at James Comey.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's something else that you play out in beats in the film. I mean, even after the decision's made, I thought it was really well done. Again, it's called The Comey Rule. You can get it across the board on so many different platforms. Just Google it, The Comey Rule. But it's on Showtime and will be re-shown on Showtime through October also. But it's widely available on VOD everywhere. Yep. You know how I feel about your work. I think you're just great. I happen to be very personally fond of you as well. But yeah, it's so much fun to visit with you. Billy Ray!
Yep.
Hi, how are you? I want to thank you for supporting Mark Thompson here on the Edge Radio. Fantastic show with all the jokes and the commentary and the politics. You can listen to this little pageant on iTunes or Stitcher, or you can just go to the damn website, edge-show.com. Stupid. Why is there a dash?
edge-show.com.